humanitarian expert and international aid diplomat. He is a noted expert on crimes against humanity. He is a professor of global health and humanitarian affairs at the University of Manchester, an associate of the International Center for Humanitarian Affairs, and also the Geneva Center for Security and Policy. He is also the special representative for the Aegis Trust and the vice chair of the Non-Violent Peace Force. He has an experience in over 130 countries, serving in senior positions in the British government and at the United Nations, WHO, and at the IFRC. He is the author of the book Against the Tide of Evil, a first-hand account on why we failed to stop the first genocide of the 21st century in Darfur, despite the lessons of the last genocide of the 20th century in Rwanda, where he was also present. This is not an indication that problems follow him. Maybe he follows problems. The second speaker is Dr. Fiona Terry, who has spent most of the last 20 years with humanitarian operations in different parts of the world, including northern Iraq, Somalia, the Great Lakes region of Africa, Liberia, Sudan, and Myanmar. She worked for a decade with MSF, both in the field and its Paris headquarters, before working for several years with the International Committee of the Red Cross. Dr. Terry holds a PhD in International Relations and Political Science from the Australian National University and is the author of Condemned to Repeat, The Paradox of Humanitarian Action, which won the 2006 from where? Okay, that one. Award for Ideas Improving World Order. As an independent researcher, she has undertaken several in-depth studies for the ICRC, including on the practice of neutrality in South Sudan and Afghanistan, and on violations of the protected status of health care in conflicts around the world. She is a member of the editorial committee of the International Review of the Red Cross. I want you to join me in welcoming the two speakers.
Prepared the answers to completely different questions. So what do? I don't know. Let us see. I think, firstly I want to say that sometimes trouble does follow me, because I have very mixed memories about being in this room. Because it was in this very room last year, a year ago, that I was giving, sorry?
September 2013.
Sorry, yes, that's right. There was this, the Westgate bombing just around the corner. And in fact, I was speaking here at the moment, and in fact, the podium was on the other side, and this was the second Hungarian Memorial Lecture, which I was honored to give during the Nairobi Book Festival, talking about my book and so on and so forth. So, I remember that with great sadness, and my thoughts go out still to those people who are recovering, society as a whole that is recovering. Let me start. The story of human progress is characterized by our quest for its underlying principles. It is as if we are constantly driving ourselves to uncover some greater truth that, if we could but work it out, would bring us to the ultimate understanding to save humanity. So in other words, human beings are distinguished from animals in the sense that we're constantly seeking for underlying principles for everything. We understand this quite easily in the physical and material sphere, i.e. whether it is the principles of gravity or the principles of market capitalism. And once we have figured out how some parts of the physical world think, we can apply those principles to unravel the mysteries of other parts. For example, make machines to reach the moon and devise formulae to make us rich. The difficulty with principles arises when we venture into a more abstract world, that of our hearts and souls. This is not for want of inspiration. All the great religions of the world, with remarkable commonality among them, have given us principles by which to lead better and nobler lives. Another foundation lies the shared notion of being good by doing good to others. But where do such principles come from? Now, philosophers tell us that principles emerge from our subconscious and are shaped by our inherent morality into norms or imperatives that are beyond debate. Or are they? The comedian Groucho Marx said, I have principles. You don't like them? No problem. I have a suitcase full of other principles. And another Marx, Karl Marx this time, completely mystified us by saying, we develop new principles for the world out of the world's own principles. So I'm still trying to figure out what that means. The psychologist Alfred Adler shrewdly commented that it's always easier to fight for one's principles than to live up to them. While the statesman Herbert Samuel reposted that it is easy to be tolerant of the principles of other people if you have none of your own. It's indeed true that some of humanity's greatest achievements have been made in the name of absolute principles, such as the struggle for equality among women and men. At the same time, it is even more true that the clash among principles has been responsible for the infliction of some of the worst brutalities that we are seeing as numerous historic and current conflicts illustrate. I've said enough, I hope, to raise the shadow of a doubt, at least by wondering whether principles are always a good thing. And are strong principles automatically better than weak ones? Furthermore, do the strongly principle contribute better to humanity than the less holy? Let's keep this in mind as we turn to discuss humanitarian principles. The humanitarian instinct, the desire to reach out to another in distress, is as old as us. It comes from the notion of humanity, described simply as the feeling of goodwill towards fellow humans. I understood this in real terms when I visited the Iranian Red Crescent. The National Society was busy tackling huge crises due to earthquakes and wars. But amidst all that drama, calmly sat a group of well-dressed middle-class women in the Tehran branch. They were collecting pots and pans, bed linen, and other domestic items. For whom, I wonder? For the earthquake victims? No. Apparently, many young Iranians were too poor to marry because they lacked the physical basis to start an independent household. And so the compassion of the good housewives of Tehran was aroused to contribute in the way they knew. And so humanitarianism may be defined very simply as acts intended to have a beneficial impact on humanity. And the intention is all important. It is far more important even than the act itself or even the results. It's the intention that matters. But the Tehran women also taught me what Jean Pictet meant when he said, without a magnifying glass of imagination, charity tends to be short-sighted. Today, the notion of humanity is projected as the altruistic foundational principle of the humanitarian enterprise. But evolutionary scientists say that this is really driven by the survival self-interest of our species in a harsh world. Therefore, altruism has very sound biological roots. But as humans got into more organized societies, rules and regulations were needed for practical reasons. And so our random feelings of goodwill also got codified. Thus, all religions formulated the principle, do unto others what you want others to do unto you. This was a clever balancing act between selfish self-survival on one hand and selfless cooperation on the other. Without this balance, we would all perish. Intrinsic to the notion of humanity, as it got refined, was a concept of charity. Jean Pictet defines this elegantly as the effort demanded of us, either inwardly or from the outside, which becomes a second nature to relieve and put an end to the sufferings of others. Consider this carefully. His formulation has two parts. First, the familiar relief of suffering, and second, as an indivisible extension of the first, the tackling of the underlying causes of the suffering. This duality is not new. In every faith and in every culture across space and time, the humanitarian has always been enjoined to pay equal and simultaneous attention to response and prevention. Why is that? The core belief that underpins this And intrinsic to the notion of humanity is a powerful idea of dignity. When this is compromised through misfortune of any sort, its restoration is the ultimate objective of the humanitarian instincts. Gradually, this evolved into what we nowadays call human rights. But the desire and struggle for all human rights is driven by the humanitarian instinct. Today's dichotomy between human rights and humanitarianism was never there at the foundation of both concepts. Meanwhile, the humanitarian enterprise as we know it today was actually born a very, very long time ago, when benevolent feelings for our own family and neighbors were extended to strangers. Again, this was for utilitarian reasons, when people looked outward from their own homes and saw the necessity to cooperate with the bigger world out there. That was the beginning of what we now call globalization. From this, the principle we know as universality came into being. This was a logical derivation and extension of the principle of humanity. In the words of the Chinese philosopher Betty, only a love which makes no distinction will save the world. But we have to thank Genghis Khan for some of the earliest practical developments of humanitarian principles. You'll be surprised. Because Genghis Khan is reviled unfairly in history because he was so successful in using propaganda and misinformation as tools of war. So that, ironically, this has come to color perceptions of him as a mass murderer and war criminal. Actually, he practiced a framework of protection for civilians and non-combatants that we know now as international humanitarian law and that eventually developed into the Geneva Conventions. Genghis Khan was a humanitarian because he had to be so, to enable his nation of less than 1 million to conquer most of the then known world. In other words, and think about this carefully, we see from the history of warfare that it was a requirement for efficient war making that boosted humanitarian thinking. Much later, in the 1850s, the Red Cross founder Henry Dunant arrived at the same logic. In turn, this gave us two more principles, that of impartiality and neutrality. The principle of impartiality is a derivative of the principles of humanity and universality. As such, it is more about the means of humanitarian delivery rather than its motivation. It encompasses, the principle of impartiality encompasses two complex notions. First, that of non-discrimination, and second, that of proportionality. The starting point is a shared recognition of the commonality of our human suffering. But this is not about treating everyone equally, because the humanitarian imperative also requires us to be effective by targeting available limited resources towards those whose needs are most urgent and those who are most likely to benefit. Now, medical practitioners are familiar with this notion in their practice of triage, attending first to those who can be saved and last to those who will die anyway. Thus, most and earliest help must go where the most important difference will result, regardless of any other consideration. The principle of impartiality, however, tells us more about the motivation of the humanitarian actor rather than about the act itself. And therein lies the greatest challenge to the integrity of humanitarianism. Neutrality itself, the word neutrality, doesn't itself have any moral or ethical value. This only emerges when the concept is applied in particular situations. Because neutrality is neither one thing or the other. It has no value. So it only becomes valuable or valueless when you actually apply it in a particular context. Now, the usefulness of neutrality has long been self-evident in military situations where the notion was first born. As long ago as the Crusades in the Middle East, Saladin gave safe passage to the war wounded of the European invaders and indeed offered his own physicians to go and help them. This meant that the helpers had to be assured of their safety and of non-interference by all sides so that they could go about their work in an effective manner. By and large, the idea of military neutrality came to be well accepted and enshrined in the Geneva Conventions because this was in the interest of all fighting groups. Remember what I said earlier on. We think humanitarianism comes from the heart. It does. But actually it required cruelty and barbarism and warfare to develop it to its full potential. Now, the difficulty with the notion of neutrality comes from the strict injunction on humanitarians never to engage in ideological controversy. The reason usually given is that this would constrain humanitarians from doing their work, as they would surely lose the confidence of warring groups if they opine on disputed matters and therefore be seen as taking sides. Thus, hear no evil, see no evil, and certainly speak not on evil has become the mantra if you want access to help the victims of evil. The difficulty with this in today's world is that it invites good Samaritans not to trouble themselves with assessing the costs and benefits of making tough moral choices. Avoidance has become the default and the lazy route for humanitarians today. I was personally faced with this dilemma in the most testing time of my career. In 2003-2004, as the UN's resident and humanitarian coordinator for Sudan, when diplomatic efforts were failing to stop the first genocide of the 21st century in Darfur. My instruction from the top of the UN was to deliver humanitarian aid to Darfur and keep quiet on the unfolding evil there. But having myself been in Rwanda 10 years previously and seen what happens when you look away, I decided to go public in the loudest possible terms. Why, how, and what happened is detailed in my book, Against Kind of Evil. But in standing up to take a position, I deliberately abandoned neutrality. Did that mean that I stopped being a humanitarian? I got praised and abused for my actions in equal measure. Senior aid colleagues said that I had breached my duty as a humanitarian coordinator. At the same time, many Sudanese wrote to express thanks for giving them hope and voice where they had none. And did not Pictet say that principled humanitarianism is also about addressing the causes and not just the symptoms of need? One newspaper editorial of the day in 2004 carried the headline, "Is Kapila a hero or a villain?" And after dissecting my conduct in excruciating personal detail, the editorial concluded, he's a bit of a both. Kapila is both a hero and a villain. So probably like any of you. But I wonder what you would have done if you had been in my position. What then are the issues of principle faced by today's humanitarian? The first challenge crystallizes out of the personal example I have just given. The humanitarian principles are held to be a holistic and invisible package. But from a lifetime of practical experience, I don't know of any reality that I have been a part of that provides the context for the measured and equal application. Almost invariably, there is a dilemma of choice to make. And in taking the least worst course of action to get a job done, there is an implicit trade-off between the principles. Indeed, if there was not, we would just sit there, paralyzed into inaction. So the unease I have with the propagated theology of the humanitarian ayatollahs is that though humanitarian principles are based on a moral foundation, as I've said at the very beginning, the logic of the correct application is essentially to deprive the implementer, the individual humanitarian, of making personal moral choice. And therefore, if you remove the personal morality out of institutionalized decision making, the humanitarian enterprise will eventually die. The second challenge is the one that flows from the context created by the age we live in, which is that of unprecedented and progressive globalization. By globalization, I mean the interconnectedness of people and ideas, good and bad, from all corners of the world. This means that what happens in one place and how we react to that has instant reverberations elsewhere. It sends signals, it creates expectations, and it establishes precedents. Thus, inconsistencies in how we express our compassion in this or that place is perhaps the greatest challenge to principled humanitarians. What then, when that happens, why should anyone believe in the rhetoric of humanity or universality? A related concern, also flowing from the search from the march of globalization, is raised by shifting public expectations, where once people were content or indeed grateful to be the passive recipients of charity, they now question why they are poor or vulnerable and want something to be done about it. They want fairness and justice as much as they want food and water. Of course, this is a sign of success from all those initiatives on participation and capacity building promoted by humanitarians themselves. But it does complicate the lives of principled humanitarians. One woman in Afghanistan, previously known as a victim, but now calling herself a survivor, thanks to the empowerment workshop that an NGO had put her on, said to me as I handed out the certificates at the end of the workshop, "I can't eat your principles." Much to my relief, she was too polite to add, "Neither can I eat your certificate." My third concern is with the technocratization of the humanitarian business. Of course, it's right that humanitarian action should be evidence-based and results-focused. It should use methods and tools of proven efficacy, wielded by people skilled to do so through training and tested and certified accordingly. This means systematization of knowledge and its promotion in an organized manner. But we are already observing that as humanitarianism becomes a profession rather than as a vocation, carving out a career within humanitarian business becomes a driver rather than the provision of service. In such a rational and progressively competent world, protocols replace principles, and principles become slogans. But when real life circumstances, like the ones I've been placed in for my few examples, when real life circumstances emerge for which the humanitarian academy has not developed the right protocol, our expert may have lost the instinct to look at principle to show the way. I, for one, very much hope that the professionals will allow the good ladies of Tehran to collect their pots and pans in peace and not force them into master's courses on humanitarianism. The fourth challenge is caused by the massive growth of corporate humanitarianism. The global humanitarian industry is vast, valued at some $30 billion US, considering both international assistance and domestic spending, and I think that's an underestimate. It employs millions of staff, volunteers, and contractors, and spans tens of thousands of governmental and non-governmental organizations. And among the latter, one noteworthy phenomenon is the growth of branded multinational NGOs as humanitarian corporations. They function according to many types of organizational models, and a handful of them have turnovers approaching or exceeding $1 billion annually. Some have called them monopolies, and as with all monopolies, they may be tempted to maintain their status through networks of patronage that breed corruption and exclusion. The wider effects of corporate humanitarianism on the humanitarian sector are still emerging. But questions to be asked are the same as for commercial monopolies. When does a humanitarian organization become so big as to be against the public interest? Should it then be broken up? Like broken up the banks? Humanitarian action is ultimately a cornerstone or retail business. But when this has to be packaged up to the wholesale level by the logic of corporate humanitarianism, which incidentally also now includes the private sector and the military, are principled, a regulatory check, or an unwelcome constraint. The rituals of the aid industry are organized under categories such as humanitarian, development, transition, human rights, and so on. But people don't see themselves as being so simply labeled, especially those for whom living with crisis and disaster is a new norm. In this mixed up world, whose principles apply? And are our traditional humanitarian principles up to the job? When situations cannot be defined as humanitarian, My final and fifth anxiety stems from something much more profound and serious. This is about whether the well of empathy from which all humanitarianism draws its nourishment is running dry. Because in our organized, technocratized, corporatized humanitarian business, we have moved too far away from thinking about the word human in humanitarian. I understood this in 2004, very personally, as I stood on the 38th floor of the United Nations headquarters in New York, pleading in vain for my big bosses to support me in stopping the Darfur genocide. And as I looked out of the window of the office of the then UN Secretary General Fiona, down onto the sidewalk of First Avenue, the people going about their business looked like tiny insects. 10 years previously, in 1994, when I heard the call by the genocidaires to crush the Tutsi insects, my eyes drifted to the wall of the New York office, where hung a beautifully calligraphed UN charter with its famous opening lines, "We the peoples." I understood then that when you are so high up that we the peoples are reduced to insects, then the distance is too vast to be bridged just by principles. So that then is my list of threats to the future of humanitarian principles. It is not terrorism or drones or Ebola or climate change or the inconsistency of donors or capacity issues or funding or access, but just us and how we shape our own thinking. Earlier on, I spoke quite a bit about the historical roots of our humanitarian principles, extending way back and beyond the modern era associated with the genius of the Red Cross Red Crescent that polished them up into what has become a remarkably useful package that has brought much hope and comfort to humanity through most difficult of times. But the same history also teaches us that although these principles appear to have survived remarkably well across many centuries and indeed millennia, each generation must do its own work to give them the clarity of meaning specific to the practical actions needed for that age. The Dutch principles draw fresh life again and again and again and again. But is there not a paradox in all this? In order to be born again, you have to first die. In our humanitarian sphere, we may call this our failures. Our principles are ultimately our ideals, and as such, we are bound to fail, quite frequently. And as I look back onto my own experiences of the past 30 years, there is a long list of failures of which I have been a part. I'm sorry to say, I may even have contributed towards those failures. But what I find remarkable, as I reflect on this, what I find remarkable is not that we often fail, but how often we succeed against all the odds. So, friends, that then, in conclusion, is the ultimate power of humanitarian principles, whatever they mean to you. Put simply, they are what drive you to carry on trying, even as you keep on failing. Thank you.
But do we really understand what they meant? Well, I'm really sorry we did not talk before this talk, so I also had thought about, picking apart the principles. But I will do it a little bit more quickly, given that Mukesh has given us such a fabulous overview. But so, just very briefly, for me, humanitarian principles provide the ethical and operational norms to guide behaviour. They are not values that we are striving to uphold in themselves. And you really do hear often in aid organisations, oh, I can't do that because it's against my principles, full stop. It's like, well, what principles are you talking about and why can't you do it? Because as you'll see, with Mukesh, I agree thoroughly that it's very difficult to uphold all the principles all the time. They often come into conflict. So I too believe that obviously humanity is the core ambition of humanitarian action, and it's to save the life and respect the dignity of every individual on the basis of our shared humanity. That's it. It's just the most basic of humanitarian ideals, but dignity, as Mukesh said, is absolutely essential to it. You know, you can't give humanitarian relief in a concentration camp, in my view. You know, you have to have certain standards, and it has to be dignified. Impartiality is the logical way of dealing with this. If we think everybody is equal by virtue of their membership in humanity, obviously we do not discriminate against them. So it is an operational principle to uphold the idea, the value of humanity. So aid for all with no adverse discrimination. And so that's very simple. We think everyone's equal. We won't discriminate against them. But suffering is not always equal, and those in most need must be helped first. Now, impartiality is really quite an uncontroversial principle within the humanitarian world. But if you think about it in practice, really, who acts with great impartiality today? If you look on the global scale, where we allocate money, it is so much more allocated to disasters that are mediatized or popular, or there is a political agenda behind it. It's very rare that you'll see humanitarian aid organisations going to meet needs in some parts of India, where you could argue on the basis of need, the need might be greater than in some other parts of the world. And also we see, I think, a few more now faith-based organisations who prefer to give aid to people on the basis of their religion. And then we had a very big problem with impartiality in a country like North Korea during the famine in the late 90s and the early 2000s, where aid was channeled through the government of Kim Jong-il, and he was allocating the aid on the basis of loyalty to the regime, not on the basis of need at all. And even once we had, as MSF at that time, screamed about this and yelled and said there is nothing humanitarian about what we are doing in North Korea today, it went on as usual. And so aid was really very much part of the system of oppression in North Korea. But neutrality has been the most controversial, as I said, of all the principles. And that's where I, through watching the way that the ICRC thinks about neutrality and the Red Cross movement as a whole, realised that there is no intrinsic moral value to being neutral. But it is simply a tool, as the principle is written itself, in order to continue to enjoy the confidence of all. That is very pragmatic, very pragmatic. So often people pitch pragmatism versus principles. In fact, the principles are very pragmatic. It's in order to keep the confidence of all. It is a posture of neutrality that you must adopt when you go into negotiations or dialogue with different belligerent parties. And it's really about facilitating access to people on all sides of conflict. It's about not giving people a pretext to stopping you going here or there. So it's not easy to adhere to them. Sorry, it's very difficult to see that. There are pressures from governments, obviously, who want a national flavour to aid to justify tax spending in their countries of origin. Impartiality also implies knowledge of who is in the greatest need, where, and of course in Somalia today it's impossible to practice impartiality. Aid is very much given on the basis of where aid organisations can get access, where they may have the least security problems. Of course you can argue there are needs everywhere in Somalia, and I'll be the first to say there are, but there is no needs assessment, because if you want to give aid impartially, well, that also means that you have to have conduct a needs assessment. I'm sorry, I forgot the other principle, independence, which of course is the prerequisite for upholding other principles. You cannot be neutral or impartial unless you're independent. You're independent of all extraneous political, military, social and religious influences. If you are too close to one donor government, you will not be perceived as neutral. And that's the big question. How many aid organisations today can truly say that they are independent of their donor governments, if their donor governments have a political agenda, if they're not working with pure humanitarian interests in mind? I think there are very, very few who have 100% of private funding, or even 80%, or enough private funding in a country where they are able to say, we are not allied with any government, we have no other agenda other than humanitarian. And even though they may feel that that doesn't matter, because even if you're getting donor money from the United States but you are able to program it, this is true, that as long as you're able then to use that aid to meet your needs, it shouldn't be a problem. But therein comes the question of perception, which is really the practical measure of neutrality around the world. So I'm going to also use an example from Darfur. I was sure that Mukesh was going to say the principles are dead, and I was going to be defending them, and so I was even going to go onto his turf. I thought, yeah, he's going to talk about Darfur, so I'm going to talk about Darfur. See, I had planned this out, Mukesh. I'm so disappointed. But I think Darfur is a fabulous example of where the principles really can sometimes clash, and how ridiculous it is when humanitarian aid organisations just are using it as a mantra and not using principles as a way of trying to think and unpick the certain dilemmas they face in the field. And this was a dilemma that the ICRC faced in trying to deliver food aid to villages, farming villages that have been victimised by the government in Khartoum and the Janjaweed. And so ICRC was trying to bring food to these villages because a lot of the people had left their villages and gone to the IDP camps, the displaced persons camps, in search of refuge, and because they simply couldn't live on the ground anymore because it was a scorched earth policy. So the ICRC was trying to bring this food in. And as it does, it acted in neutrality, and it tried to have dialogue with different parties. And the villages were often, these trucks would have to pass through a lot of the areas inhabited by the Arab Damrats, the nomadic Arab people. And so when ICRC did its needs assessment, it decided that food was needed in the farming villages, but food was not needed in these Arab Damrats. And so it decided, because it knew that, you know, if the trucks needed passage to come through, you have to do something for both sides, because the perception of neutrality was very strong. So the ICRC has a big advantage over a lot of other organisations, and it has a wide palette of different activities to offer. So there was the offer of helping to rehabilitate the wells and vaccinate the livestock, the camels, etc. And it worked for a while. These truckloads of food were able to come through to different villages. But after a certain point, food really became the issue, gold. Even though it wasn't strictly needed, it became a big point of contention. And a lot of the Arab Damrats did not want to see this food coming through their area anymore without being given some of it. So the ICRC faced a bit of a dilemma between the idea of the principle of impartiality, where they had clearly assessed these people did not need food, and the principle of neutrality, or the perception of neutrality. And it was a very pragmatic decision, because at the end of the day, if you continue to deliver food to these villages, well, there was a very good chance that was going to incite theft by the other group, and that could end up with a much greater loss of life. So in order to be able to basically deliver the food, the compromise was made completely on impartiality. Food was delivered on the way to the Arab Damrat, and that was the only way really to be able to get it all the way through to the villages who were really in need of it. So that's just one example of when these different principles can clash. And the ICRC really, in spite of, you know, so much terror that had gone on in Darfur, also by having a very neutral approach, was able to open dialogue with, or have dialogue, continuous dialogue with the Darfur, with the Khartoum regime, who even allowed, I think when you think about it, it's quite extraordinary, who even allowed the ICRC to mount this field surgical team, which was in effect putting back together their own enemies. It was allowing humanitarian aid or humanitarian assistance in the form of surgical care to save the lives of its enemies. And so I think that was an enormous achievement to be able to negotiate that with a government who had been so difficult and remained and continues to be with regards to Darfur. But that's, for me, the power of this argument, this idea of neutrality. Because I think the other thing we have to do is we really have to, if we wanted to throw the principles out, we have to think, well, what is the alternative for humanitarian actors today? And we don't need to look further than Afghanistan to see that aid organisations have or did abandon the humanitarian principles in their operations in Afghanistan. And in fact, it wasn't the first time they had done this, because unfortunately aid organisations never learn from past mistakes. But there was, you know, during the Soviet era, when they were invading Afghanistan and supporting a regime in Kabul, aid organisations had very much sided at that time with the Mujahideen, thinking this is a just war, we have to aid the Mujahideen, and really had funneled aid with the US government support across the border from Pakistan into the mountains of Afghanistan. MSF was there as one organisation among many others who had really taken the side of the Mujahideen against the Soviet invaders. And yet, when the Soviets left Afghanistan, and suddenly these heroes, these warriors, as they referred to them, became warlords in Afghanistan. And you know, the infighting between the factions after the Soviets left Kabul caused more destruction than during the 10 years that the Soviets were inside Afghanistan. And so the ideal of a warrior, the ideal of a just side, should really have fizzled out for aid organisations at that time. Of course, the Soviet Union had not allowed aid organisations access to other areas, so it was very difficult to be neutral during that period of Soviet history. But nevertheless, you would have thought that aid organisations would have had a little bit more caution before they leapt straight in after the Taliban looked like they had been routed in 2002, 2003, and yet they just accepted that the discourse of the victors was that no more need for humanitarian aid, we are now in a situation of peace, and therefore most organisations abandoned their neutrality, helping to stabilise the areas outside in favour of legitimising that regime. Of course, nobody expected the Taliban to come back, but they hadn't read their history books very well about Afghanistan if they really, really believed that that war was going to be over and peace would be restored to Afghanistan. So it became a huge problem for those aid organisations because the Taliban, as they came back and became more and more resurgent, took over more and more territory, aid organisations found that they themselves became target of attacks and they were no longer able to, it was far too dangerous to have access. Now the ICRC went through its own crisis, big crisis in Afghanistan, and it was this that I studied for them which made me so convinced of how important neutrality is. Because it was the ICRC that lost the first foreign aid worker after the US invasion in 2003, a water engineer by the name of Ricardo Mungia. Now Ricardo, why it shocked the ICRC so much, because unfortunately, you know, there are many victims unfortunately more and more of aid organisations around the world. But what was so particularly shocking for the ICRC about Ricardo's death was that he was shot dead by a man who was wearing an ICRC prosthesis on his leg. And he was shot dead on the order of Mullah Dadallah, who also had an ICRC prosthesis on his leg. So it turned upside down the whole notion that for many years the ICRC and many organisations have really believed that to know us is to accept us. To know, you know us, we've aided, for 30 years we've been in Afghanistan helping. The ICRC has probably at one time or another touched every family, and yet this was an assassination, overt assassination carried out because he had hesitated with the gunman, and it wasn't until it was confirmed over the phone that he was given the order to shoot. And he left the Afghan staff who were working with ICRC alone, and it was really an attack on an expatriate. So the ICRC started to think, we have to rethink these principles. Maybe the principles are dead. Maybe it's no longer possible to work in the way we've always worked around the world. And it was only a few months in between that incident that also there was the attack on the ICRC headquarters in Baghdad. So it was a very troubled time for the ICRC. But rather than abandoning the principles altogether, which a lot of NGOs have done, it did pull out of the contested areas and back to government-controlled areas where it was safe, but immediately started to think about, we have to understand what's happened, we have to open dialogue. And so took the very risky approach at that time of trying to engage with the Taliban. And why I say it was risky was because neutrality was really not accepted from the American side just as much as it was not accepted from the Taliban side. The Americans were very, very hostile towards anyone that wanted to work and deliver medical, and there was no consideration of Geneva Conventions and the fact that medical assistance, once you are a non-combatant, once you're injured, you're a non-combatant, it's not assistance to the enemy. No, this was all thrown out. So it was a very, very difficult and dangerous time in Afghanistan. But slowly but surely through prison visits, because of course the ICRC was visiting Taliban who were captured and visited in prison, and through their offices in Pakistan, slowly but surely started to build up some dialogue with the Taliban, started to understand that the health needs in these Taliban-controlled areas were terrible, nobody was there, and started to slowly but surely give assistance to them. And over a period of time, built up a trust. Okay, it's not a perfect trust because, of course, it's very difficult with the drone attacks and the military taking out commanders. We face the same thing in Somalia. You can't really rely on security guarantees 100%. But just the fact that the ICRC is in Kandahar Hospital, which, okay, is in a government-controlled area, but not being attacked there by the Taliban, means that so many people in the south of Afghanistan can get this vital care that they so badly need. And so I think that for me, this was really the example of where there is, you can only abandon your neutrality once, because once you've done something in one country and you've been seen to be on the side of one of the parties to the conflict, that will be known around the world. We're living in a very globalized age, as Mukesh said, with social media. We can't hide it now. Every statement made in one context will be listened to in another context. I was in Afghanistan at the time when the ICRC made a statement on Gaza, and it was incredible the impact that had on the interlocutors. Suddenly, the Taliban had much greater respect for ICRC because to have made a statement, I think it was on the illegality under international law of the war that had been set up, was for them proof that the ICRC was not necessarily, it was not just an agent of the imperialist West. So yes, so I'm convinced, but the trouble is there are so many organisations who are not necessarily, or actually, to be honest with you, I don't even think it goes that far. I think that, like Mukesh, the aid industry has really become an industry where people pay lip service to these ideas of principles. I mean, donors have done the right thing in some respects in trying to make aid organisations sign on to codes of conduct that contain the principles that we will work in this way. But they just pay lip service to it, these aid organisations. And in fact, recently in Somalia, it was even ECHO, last down here, who had to make NGOs choose between accepting money if they want to be involved in stabilisation activities alongside Amazon, or accepting ECHO humanitarian money, because he, as a donor, did not want to mix the two concepts. But it is a donor preaching to an NGO about this notion of neutrality and keeping distance from a belligerent party to a conflict, which is quite staggering, I think, today. So the aid organisations who did abandon neutrality have found it very hard to make their way back, and I think there are lots of issues that we can, I'll probably stop very soon, that we can debate longer between the difficulty also of respecting humanitarian principles or upholding them if you are a multi-mandate organisation who is doing a bit of development, which is necessarily political, and you want to also retain the specificity of being a humanitarian actor. So I will leave that one for you guys if you want to engage on that. It is little wonder that some organisations are being branded as simply working for their governments, because many of them are, and it's not just Western organisations that this is happening to. And I think there needs to be much greater independence, and I think we have to have a lot more of these discussions, particularly coming up to the World Humanitarian Summit, because we can't anymore pretend that it's all hunky-dory and that we can continue to go along this way, because we are the most stupid. The belligerents have worked it out. They've worked out which organisations are very much working to the agenda of political parties and which are working more independently. And I feel very sorry for UN agencies, but if you look at Somalia, I think we may be seeing what is to come. That it's very difficult. For years, for decades, we've been going along with this notion that UNICEF and ICHA and UNHCR and WHO can be humanitarian blue UN, and the political bodies, the political negotiation and the political mission is the black UN, and that all the belligerents are going to understand this difference and accept that the blue UN is only humanitarian with only humanitarian ideals in mind, and the black UN is the political heads. And of course this fiction has become even more difficult when you have a humanitarian coordinator who is also a deputy SRSG, etc. We are just blending the political and the humanitarian together. And I think it's time that we face this full on and we bring a good discussion to the World Humanitarian Forum to say what we've got right now is not working. We need to give it a big shake-up and we need to rethink the whole architecture of the humanitarian system. But I would argue with the principles at the core, because the principles are not dead. They are all we've got and they can be very effective. They're not going to be the Alibaba open sesame that's going to give us access everywhere all the time. There are some groups out there, ISIS, some members of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, who reject 100% notions that we are defending of humanity. But they will hopefully at some stage become a minority, and well, they're not a majority, but hopefully they'll diminish. I'm not neutral when it comes to that, I think. But I think that we need to anyway engage with them and see, because parties to a conflict can change. We saw that with Afghanistan when they started to realise themselves, as Genghis Khan and others had realised, that they also needed to win the hearts and minds of the population. And by allowing humanitarian actors in, it was to their advantage. Well, that's fine. If it's helping the civilian population and we're left alone to do our work, well, that's the best we can hope for. So I think without the principles, we are little more than a supermarket chain, and we don't really stand for anything. So we may as well subcontract out to Nakumat, and then we can do away with the pretense. But I think that we need to really fight for an idea full of ideals of humanitarian.
And the red card as a matter of finality. As you prepare to think through your question, I'll open up the floor. Fiona, you make an interesting argument, both in your closing statement and in your book, that if we were to reduce, and I try to quote you, humanitarianism to a logistical exercise, we might as well give this business to the Nakumats of this world. And you also add in your book, then we give them mercenaries to provide security to them. Mukesh, in agreement, indicates that the biggest risk to humanitarianism now is the technocratization, bureaucratization, and corporatization of aid and humanitarianism. Now, the risk is this. You seem to both suggest that we go back 100 years to Henry Dunant, where humanitarian exercise was about collecting people who are willing to give assistance in good faith, can provide that assistance, and there will be no obligation on the outcome of the specific assistance they provide to those in need. The idea of making humanitarianism professional was to introduce an element of accountability, standardization of service, quality assurance, quality improvement. And in one evening, you both seem to suggest that this may not be the right path to take. Are we ready with your questions? First person here, and then there is a lady at the back. So, please, you can comment and then we'll take the question thereafter.
I think if you read on, you might see though in the book that I do think we have a very strong ethical obligation for the finality of our work. In fact, it's one of the few parts I would sort of disagree with Mukesh on, is that the intention, I agree, is very important, but the consequences are equally important. And my whole book was really about the ethics of how do we judge the consequences of our acts, how do we measure it, we should learn more from history of what's happened so that we can take greater responsibility and make much more hard-headed choices about what we're doing. And my problem with the accountability standards and the standardizations was exactly that. It didn't talk about the ethical side enough.
Can I disagree? For the sake of disagreeing, I want to. I have a louder voice. I think a couple of points really. We are very arrogant. We think that if you plan A plus B plus C, you will reach a destination B. But the story of human endeavor and human enterprise of any sort is that almost always what you seek, what you plan to do, never comes out because externalities get in the way. The Taliban get in the way, or some donor gets in the way, and so on and so forth. Therefore, I think the only pure thing left is the humanitarian intention. I don't know what the consequences are going to be because there are too many other factors at play. So for me, if we don't start with the right intentions, we're not going to get the right consequences. And in any case, when the judgment is written, it is the intentions that need to be judged. It was, we may make mistakes, but were we right in doing them? Now, one other thing while we're at it, the reason I have difficulty with some of your remarks, Fiona, is exactly, or not your remarks, but your quotation of the principles, is when words like perception of neutrality and posture are used, immediately, to me, they sound as if you are trying to hoodwink people. So, when you say, it's a perception that matters. Well, I'm sorry. It's a reality that matters, not the perception. And when you start playing clever game, not you personally, you're a nice person, but and that's more than a perception. But when you start playing and hoodwinking and saying, well, if you have this flag there, if you go through this way, if you hand a little bit there, and then you drive through there, we will have this or other thing. People are not stupid. And increasingly in the globalized interconnected world, they're even less stupid. So I want honesty in the humanitarian business, not perceptions, not posture. And I think this is where we need to go on. We live in a different world from the world of Henry Dunant in that sense, where life was in a sense black and white.
Well, Mukesh, the world is in black and white.
Sorry?
The world of Henry Dunant is the same world we live in. People are still dying in front of us. People still are found injured. What will be different between the Henry Dunant time and the time we live in? The needs seem to be more or less the same.
I think true, the needs are the same in the kind of big word sense of the phrase, but what is different is the intention. The one point to make, it is on that, the purity of the intention, and also what is different is, and here I totally agree with Fiona, in that we are mixing up a number of objectives together, and when you start doing that, then you're doing trade-offs, aren't you? Poor old Henry Dunant, he was kind of just trying to get some wounded treated and all that kind of stuff. And by the way, a note, you're the better historian than me. Everyone thinks that Henry Dunant invented humanitarianism. Actually, what Henry Dunant did was, he stood on the corner of the battlefield and he observed the women of that village, whatever it's called, I forgot his name. On the battlefield sort of this village. And he observed these mothers of the village going around in a disorganized manner, just helping. In other words, the idea, and Henry Dunant's idea was to organize this natural expression of compassion into, after all, he's a businessman, though a failed businessman, he was still a businessman, so into something. But the idea did not come from Henry Dunant. The idea came from the women of the villages around Freedom. So this again, I come back to the issue of intention, really. And I think we're losing the plot, because in a sense, we are kind of, trying to be multi-intention, comprehensive, and trying to achieve, to have a cake and eat it.
I would like to claim that I've flown from London especially to hear you speak, but I would be alive, but I'm pleased to be here nonetheless. Mukesh and indeed Fiona, I've come here this week in terms of Nairobi to give some thought about South Sudan and with some colleagues. And I'd just like to invite any comments you might have on any solutions, sort of, if you like, drawing from your thoughts about if the current system is maybe it's not failed, but maybe it's not working perfectly. How might some of those, that you thinking, or maybe it's not you thinking, but how might some of your thinking lie in South Sudan in terms of some of the solutions that might be applied there? And I'll just mention one thing, obviously, as you'll be aware, we're giving thought to lessons from Rwanda, and obviously have been through a terrible time, and whether or not some of the, just the ordinary population from Rwanda might have something to share with some of the ordinary people in South Sudan. But it is giving thought about some solutions in South Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you.
After you.
One more question.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes. Yes, good evening. I'm Don Burka. I work for the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation here in Nairobi. Similar to the person who just spoke, actually my question is also related to solutions. First of all, I would like also to thank really the two speakers for the very inspiring talks. Coming from Switzerland, of course, I was happy to hear that neutrality is still a principle that is alive. Now, if we speak about Somalia, the principles of independence, neutrality, and impartiality are maybe not completely dead in Somalia, but they are definitely in quite a bad shape. And from what I can see, this has led to actually putting the people at risk. Because today, if there would be again a major crisis in Somalia, I think that most of the humanitarian organizations would have very little access to those in need and would not be able to really respond effectively. But so now what we start hearing is that actually the question is a bit like, okay, but what is then the alternative? And so what we start hearing is at least, okay, we have compromised, but at least we save life. And so if we don't do so, then what else? So my question to you would be, can we still do something to regain humanitarian space in Somalia, or is it really too late? Thank you.
You have a question?
I thought you were only taking two, but I guess I do have a question.
I can make an exception since you took the microphone.
It's right there already. Thank you very much for those speakers. It's very stimulating what you said. My question is for Fiona. My name is Ramsey. I work for the Rift Valley Institute. My question for Fiona is, when do you stop predicting consequences? I'm asking because, there's a perception broadly that the humanitarian industry is engaged ultimately in propping up an unjust world order and sanitizing. And I can imagine a situation in which we could predict consequences that would lead us all the way to that conclusion, in fact. Where, for instance, we are engaging in a country where the causes of war, the causes of the conflict, are actually rooted in, for instance, that unjust world order. And so I'm not sure if I'm being completely clear, but what I'm getting to is, when do we stop, with the predictions, and where would they ultimately lead us if we took them as far as they could go?
Can I start?
Please.
I'm leaving Sudan completely for you.
No. I can.
It's the two hard basket. Okay, well, first, of course, I can't let Mukesh have the last say on perceptions. I know I can understand where you're coming from, but I think the reality in the field is that, exactly as you said, aid organizations, we are all too arrogant. And we believe that just by going into a context and saying we are neutral, that people are going to believe it. And this is just simply not the case. And I think that aid organizations are not attuned enough to how all their statements and their actions can be perceived. And that's why I think that really, if you think about the reasons for which aid organizations are neutral as a tool to get access, you have to take into account how do they perceive your neutrality. So that's my point on that. And I think that it's very interesting to see aid organizations working very hard on thinking always about how will this action be perceived. To the question of Somalia, well, this is a really tricky one. But it is interesting in Somalia, and I'm helping MSF think through whether they should and how come back to Somalia. So this question is very interesting for me at the moment, and even just to look at Somalia and to see, or even to do a comparison between Al-Shabaab and ISIS and Al-Qaeda and some of the very difficult places to work in the world, do we have much area to maneuver? And I think so much of the equation about what are we able to do obviously is going to come down to that kind of analysis. How do they perceive us? And what are they going to allow aid organisations to do, and can we do it safely? And one of the biggest problems, or the biggest difficulties at the moment, is even knowing who is Al-Shabaab, because it has transformed so much over these, with the different killing of its leaders that have gone on. So dialogue with, and to try to get some kind of assurances that we are not going to be targeted. But if those people cannot meet with you because drones flying overhead, then it makes it extremely difficult for aid organisations to get that. So I think that's a lot more of the problem, rather than upholding the principles per se. Although, and then, you know, can you be neutral if you're not working on Al-Shabaab's side? Well, I still think that, you know, that there are a lot of organisations that weren't targeted by Al-Shabaab in the past, we think by organisations who were not even working in Al-Shabaab territory. So I do think that there is some kind of acknowledgement of different types of aid organisations. To Ramsey, how far should the consequences go? Well, I think there are really limits to humanitarian action, and we need to recognise those limits. There is only so much that we can do. And, you know, and I think that we need to be able to talk to the political players about what they're doing. If they are manipulating, if they are commandeering humanitarian action for their own agendas, this is ultimately doing us an enormous amount of harm. But we can only take responsibility for it if we go along with it. And hence the point that I was making with regards to ECHO, you know, making that point and saying we are not going to fund the aid organisations that want to go along, you know, that are going to choose sides and be part of the stabilisation process run by Amazon, because Amazon is party to the conflict. The perception on the other side will be very bad and potentially very dangerous. So, but I think that we need to realise that there are real limits, and in the Rwandan genocide, that was why MSF at that time made huge public statements in the press in France, because Francois Mitterrand, who was the president at that time, was saying, we are responding to the genocide, we are funding MDM and, you know, other French organisations to provide a humanitarian response. So MSF went really public in Le Monde with a front page of the paper saying, you do not stop a genocide with doctors. You know, it's not humanitarian action that can solve this problem. So I think we should be very clear where our responsibilities are, where they lie, and how far we are responsible for the consequences of our action. And I would say that's taking it perhaps just one step too far.
What I have, I face many dilemmas like the one you're mentioning, Somalia or South Sudan, wherever, through in a long, perhaps too long period. And here's what I worked out for myself. I don't know whether it's in the textbooks or whether it's in the principles or whether it's in some kind of doctrine by someone. Two things. And this is the answer to all the questions on any problem. But arrogance being one of them, of course. Remember, I'm a professor after all. Now, the first thing I've learned is that conflicts have to be ripe for solving. You know, there are problems to which you have no answer. And the wisdom lies in acknowledging that I don't have the answer. If you guys want to fight each other, as they're doing in South Sudan, be my guest. You know? But we know also from history that all conflicts eventually come to an end. It may take 20 years, it may take 2 years, it may take sometimes no. But they always do. So conflicts have a career. They rise, they explode, and they come down. But many other things change. So my answer on the Sudan, South Sudan side is, the situation is not ripe for solving. And it is important not to intervene in a way that may give the impression of intervention in a benign manner, call it humanitarian. But actually, at best it will do nothing, and at worst it will make matters worse. And I've seen this time and time again, even in Bosnia, where I've been very heavily involved in the days of Dayton and all that. The Dayton Agreement in Bosnia, what has it done? It has frozen the conflict in Bosnia. We celebrated recently one of the anniversaries of it. I can't remember which one. Or is it next year's? And yes, the war is at an end, but basically you have different worlds. And this is a lesson I've learned, to realize that you can't solve a conflict if people don't want to solve themselves. You can try and help in whatever way you can, but it's hard. The second lesson, practical lesson I've learned is that when I don't know what to do, and when my power in my career has come from different sources. When I had loads of money, it came from money. When I had status, like I had in Sudan, as the head of the UN, the world's representative there, it came from status. So whether it's status or money or whatever was the source of my power, sometimes even charisma, I give examples of that. It did not help to solve certain dilemmas because there was almost impossible situations, like the one that ICHA described about helping people to that way. And then my golden rule on it is very simple: ask the people. So in Somalia or South Sudan, I simply say I don't know, but I do know that if I ask people to tell me what they want, and invariably we underestimate people. And invariably we underestimate the courage of local people. And so when I was in the Blue Mountains about a couple of years ago, and I was talking to some lady looking for an interview for a film I was making, and at the end of this interview I said in my stupid, polite manner, "And what can I do for you?" And she looked at me, a kind of withering look in her face, and said, "What can you do for me? Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening to me. You'll go, and I'm going to still be here." And then she paused. And then she asked, "There is one thing you can do for me." And she said, "Photograph me. Tell people my name. Tell them that I got raped, and my daughter got raped, and I'm living here. Tell the whole world about my story, because my worry is that I will be born here, and I will die here, and no one will ever know if I exist." What that taught me was that when you ask people on the ground, they do trade-offs between relief of suffering and dignity. So there are people who have said to me, and this is in Sudan and elsewhere, in Sierra Leone and so on, they've said to me, "We'd rather eat stones than accept relief simply for the sake of filling a particular miracle." And one woman in Africa said to me, when I said to her, "Why don't you kind of compromise and do something?" And she said, "What do you mean? The sands of Darfur are red with blood, and you're telling me that I give all that up for what? Humanitarian relief?" So keep your humanitarian convoys. It is not your position to decide whether or not the people are wanting your relief food and relief convoys. Almost invariably, if you ask people on the ground, they will prioritize the dignity far greater. So my difficulty with the humanitarian enterprise, my difficulty with ICHA, much as I respect them, and my difficulty with MSF and all these other organizations, much as I respect all of them, is you're starting off from the wrong place. Because if you're starting off the solution to the problem by saying, "Here we are an organization, this is our rules, this is how we are organized, and now our dilemma and practical problem is how to express our corporatism in whatever it is." How about actually starting off from nothing? How about actually sitting somewhere in South Sudan or in the Blue Mountains and in Darfur and say, "Actually, I can do nothing, I have nothing, I will promise nothing. And let's see what people say." And you will be hugely surprised by what they say. When I gave my little story about the Afghan woman who had been overpowered by her NGO forces, what she was saying to me was, "Actually, yes, I'm a victim, but I'm going to decide." And this is what sociologists call local agency. I mean, the local actor deciding. So my answer to you, Glenn, is you are asking the wrong people business. And you need to go to South Sudan, you need to sit down in the conflict zone, you need to sit with the people and say, "What would you like us to do?" And the answer will surprise you. And I also know from experience, this is with the Red Cross, is that when you just trust and you take a few risks and you take a few gambles, you might actually be quite surprised how effective your intervention is going to be. So my strong message, and I'm getting passionate now, is get for the humanitarian business, get off the backs of the people. Don't think of arrogance as stew, either as donors, or as these people who rely on the misery of others to make their own livings, to actually do the thing for the people out there. And therefore the training part of this is, and I'm not against training or professionalization, but it's a different set of skills. So I would like courses on how you go about actually understanding what people say. This is not what community participation that we are talking about, on which there are many, many courses. This is a completely different kind of rewiring of the brain. And go into that, and you might be surprised what you may find. And I feel that the next chapter of the humanitarian enterprise is going to be in that area. It's only by doing that that we will counter the threats you see around yourself, and it's only that you will universalize. You know about China, you know about India, who's ever asked their opinion on these matters, and yet these countries are shaping humanitarianism, simply because of the size of those particular countries and the roles that they play. I don't know whether I've addressed your question, but I feel we are on the wrong, we are asking the wrong question, and we are at the wrong starting point of the journey to answer the question. I think it's literally a question of going back to the basic and starting from a different point.
Okay, great. Any other question? There is one question at the back as Sarah is moving to take the microphone there. Fiona and Mukesh. There is a disturbing idea that the more local you are as an organization, the more risk you are to the principles you try. This idea is based on the understanding that local organizations necessarily are either part of the problem or condone the problem.
So,
Do you agree with me?
yeah, who's the expert on it?
No, I definitely think that sometimes it's harder to be perceived as neutral when you are from a certain community. And it's perhaps harder, if you take Somalia, I think it is a classic example. You know, the amount of pressures that you can have from your clan and your sub-clan and your sub-sub-clan and your family is such that this is an issue that we found a lot with staff working in Somalia, but also with organisations. So, and given that in Somalia there is such a problem of fraud, and just such a monumental problem, I don't know if you're aware of that, but we're screaming about it. So, I mean, the idea of actually going into Somalia and sitting down and saying, you know, what do you want, and don't come with nothing, I'm afraid you wouldn't live very long, Mukesh. No, I wouldn't have thought that, actually. I think that, you know, so many non-local organisations are pretending to be neutral or are just, you know, brandishing it as a way of trying to get legitimacy. So, yeah, I don't know, it's not something I've thought of before that this is being branded. It's certainly a reality in Somalia that's very hard to overcome, but you can overcome it, and there can be, you know, assurances made. But you may be right, maybe it is just a way of discrediting, but when you think about how much international organisations are relying on local partners, I would not understand why they would then discredit them that way. I mean, obviously you have to place trust in your local partner if you're working that way, if you are to be effective in Somalia. So.
Well, let's kind of strip this hypocrisy. And not you. You told us to have an argument, I'm trying to have an argument. It's very hard to have an argument with you. But
Mukesh, I'll show you the red card.
yeah, okay, you will. Well, I look this way. I think, you know, I do not know many international organizations that really believe in localization. Why? Because they will go out of business. And too often, the international organizations utilize local organizations, and they call it partnership, and they call it capacity building. I think that's rubbish. That's hypocrisy. It really is. If you look at the results of that approach over the last decades, you see very meager results. Wherever you have seen sustained capacity building or the emergence of sustainable solutions to local problems, they have always come from the bottom up, not from the top. Thirdly, legitimacy only comes from below. It doesn't come from the top. Okay? What that means is that If there are local groups who are partisans, well, that's legitimacy on the ground. That's partisan. Even ICHA has to negotiate with this group and then goes to that checkpoint and goes to that particular checkpoint. So I think the idea that just because local groups are fractured in their thinking, competing with each other, that therefore we as the great saviors are going to come in from outside and are going to kind of teach these savages, these kind of inferior human beings, immoral human beings who are murdering and raping and pillaging, like in Eastern Congo, and we're going to tell them what civilization is about, which is effectively the attitude of these groups. Finally, and then you don't need to use the red card. You know, let's look at MSF. Great organization, I love them very much. No buts. I think they have the luxury to come and go. And I've seen them when they have folded their tents and crept away into the distance. And I saw this in Goa after the Rwanda genocide. Now, they did great work. They had all the hospitals and this, that, the wet bank, etc. But when the external humanitarian organizations are selective in how they operate on the basis of some imagined purism, based on those principles, and what it is really their own institutional agendas that are being implemented. We talk about trust. Well, where is the trust between the people and the international community? And that extends to humanitarian organizations as much as any else. When we say that the political enterprise has co-opted the humanitarians, well, whose fault is it? No, humanitarians, were sheep when the British government, of which I was a huge part and had a lot of money and power to give away, when I bullied humanitarian agencies and said, you're going to work it there, and this is the money you're going to have, and this is what you're going to do, they just followed like sheep, if you like, you see. So the point here is this, you see. Now humanitarians can't cry out and say, oh, we're being abused, and the locals, this, that, and the other. I think there is something smelling at the very heart of the hypocrisy that surrounds the current humanitarian system. And we're all part of a conspiracy. So, I go from British government to the UN, from there I go to the Red Cross, and now I'm professing about all these particular matters. And no doubt I'll go backwards and forwards, you see. So what I'm trying to say is, and this is my only point, it is time that we try to be honest. And when we talk about honest analysis, we question the fundamental assumptions. If you only analyze on the basis of the assumptions you make, you will get the answer that is logical to those assumptions. And I'm questioning the very fundamentals, if you like. And if you don't question the fundamentals, then the future will just be a repetition of the past.
Fiona, you must have rejoined us.
Yes, but you know what? We would need to have a whole other debate on
MSF
leaving the Rwandan refugee camps. Since I was the head of MSF when we did in Tanzania, and you are so wrong, you wouldn't believe it. But that's for another whole story. Because basically it wasn't just packing up the bags, it was about the major issue. When aid is actually turned against the people you are trying to assist, you have a moral responsibility, an ethical responsibility.
Walk away.
To stop that. If you are seeing that it's doing more harm than good, that's what it was in the Rwandan refugee camps. And by looking at history, we knew that these camps were, in fact, Paul Kagame had threatened to attack the camps, and Kibeo had been even a dress rehearsal. But anyway, that's another whole debate to have. But I really very much believe that aid organisations can't just be machines like they were in the camps saying, oh, we have donor money coming in, we're just going to accept what's going on. No, the camps were used as training bases, they were used by people who were responsible for genocide and in order to keep this population there. And I think that the morally right choice was to leave.
Okay, next speaker at the back, you had a question? Then we'll come.
Abbas wants to ask a question.
Oh, wait, there's someone at the back first, then we'll ask.
I trained him.
I was trying to think of a question, and Mukesh was my mentor when I started out, and I was trying to think of a really horrible question for him, but I can't. But the one thing I could do, you've both been sort of furiously agreeing with each other at the front. And just sort of one question, it'd be interesting to get maybe Mukesh's reflections on. How did you see the role as an RCHC? Were you quite happy to have that double hat and to play a political role as well as a humanitarian role? Would you felt constrained? I just felt that your presentation was very much about pragmatic balancing of these humanitarian principles really massive. Whereas maybe Fiona's slightly more purist, and I'm conflicted myself on some of these issues. So I just wondering your sort of reflections on the UN and how they play these principles, especially at that level of an RCHC.
I was very happy. I had a big salary. I had a flag on my car. I had thousands of staff, and I even had my own aeroplane. In fact, 2 of them. So I was very happy to be RCHC, but to be serious for a second. You know, it was very difficult, as you know. But what I have learned subsequently is that when the system itself is illogical, it's very difficult to logicalize it through protocols and training and artificial constructions. The UN is the UN, and that means that UNICEF is the UN, WHO is the UN, and the DPA, political arm, is also the UN. Now, when you have that, and this is the perception, I'm afraid, is the reality, when you have this construction, then trying to make walls and barriers and trying to say, oh, well, I'm humanitarian, you are peacekeeping, he's political. I don't think the world works like that. World works like that. Now, the challenge, therefore, is to educate the world's publics and the world's governments and the world's humanitarians is that get used to it. We live in a complex world. We also vote in elections. Doesn't mean that no Red Cross person should ever vote in a national election in their home country because they are neutral. So obviously, I've been elected in the UK and I know which side I'm going to vote on. And humanitarians not to take part in the processes which shape, if you like. So, and the same with the UN. It is right that member states should interfere and engage with the UN because the UN is fundamentally a political organization, and thank goodness it is, because it was created after the Second World War when we realized that wars don't solve problems and only politics does. So I say, let's have more politics, and let's connect the politics to all the other issues that we are here talking about, and let us try and make people understand that yes, we have to be humanitarian in our hearts, we have to be effective in our delivery, but that there is no such a thing as a humanitarian solution problem. So the problem with the RCHC role was that it was fragmented. My problem was that I was HC on Mondays and Tuesdays and RC on Wednesdays and Thursdays. If I had been the RCHC, and you'll remember you were on my staff, if we were all together in that composite way, maybe it might have been a more effective operation. We can't run away from the world of reality as it is by trying to construct some kind of artificial construction of all this. Doesn't matter whether you have separate RCs or HCs, there's still going to be a bigger boss on top of that boss and a bigger boss on top of that boss. Everybody has many bosses.
Let's say we should leave hypocrisy aside and talk honestly about some of these things. And I can give you a small example of that. In the DAP, and I think Fiona will also understand, and it's a dilemma the organization you're consulting for is going through now, MSF, and what happened in the DAP in Kenya, where unfortunately MSF staff were abducted and thank God eventually somehow they were released. But I remember at the height of the worst famine in this region over the last 6 years in 2011, where there was the influx of the Somali refugees into Kenya, and whatever happened to MSF, then Kenya Red Cross got involved into the camps and started working in the camps. But looking from 2011 up to about early 2013, there was, in my opinion, this dilemma where every time there was a bit of insecurity, the international NGOs and the UN were on a lockdown, practically. And one could understand 100% about the security. Which of course, what Mukesh was referring to, if I use it in my own example, of having your ear on the ground and really feeling and consulting the people on the ground. In a place called P42, the UN had built a whole green zone area completely for UN and NGOs and homes built, and it took us about 4 or 5 months to be even given the place to go and stay. But we decided politically to go and live in P42, right in the middle of the refugees themselves, and not very close to the UN. With the DAP itself is in town, this is about, 10 kilometers, and we decided unlike the UN and INGOs who are escorted every morning into the camp and escorted out. Obviously, we said we are not going to be escorted, we'll just go with our emblem and that should be the protection. But the fact that we ended up living inside the camps is then looking at an entire UN garrison village called the Dab, where hundreds of international workers are there, and you wonder how much does it cost every day to have the cost of one day to keep that entire contingent in there that are unable to go into these camps. And the question is, would there be a paradigm shift in this in the future? I mean, if we talk about Somalia on the other side, I think 3, 4, 5 years ago, Shabab was saying, and even teased my friends in ICHA then, and Somalia Red Crescent, they're saying, don't give us food handouts in the area that we control. Give us seeds and tools. We have plenty of water on the Juba Valley and on the Shabelle River. Plenty of water, and give us seeds and tools so that our people can grow. So when are we just going to change some of these things is the question. That even this food aid, who decides and why? In the Dab, the refugee population of Somalis are business driven. The enterprise market driven. Do they need that food handler? Why did you give them food vouchers or cash? And they would have done what they needed to do to really change. Today, it's a huge industry, and you wonder, at whose expense at the end of the day.
Thank you very much.
I'd just like to say how much I agree with you on what you've just said. That this big question, who is really benefiting at the end of the day from the humanitarian industry? And I totally understand why Al-Shabaab does not want to have food dumped into its regions when it is trying to produce stuff itself. So it's a very big problem, which may have more to do with the donor nation and surplus food, etc., than much else. But we need to, I think, as a humanitarian community, absolutely become more vocal about this kind of thing. And unfortunately, because aid organisations seem to be so dependent, particularly in Somalia, the funding crisis for aid organisations is so tight that you can't even get the debate off the table to say, what are we contributing to? Because I think there's a huge ethical question about, also in Somalia for so long, about the enormous diversion of aid and taxes being paid, and what are we contributing to it? So in a way, it comes back to the question of the Rwandan refugee camps. If there is an oppressive group controlling a population, and you are coming in and you are feeding this group that's doing the oppression, who are you really helping at the end of the day? And this has to be the question that's asked a lot more. My book came out in 2002. I tried to address all these questions, and as somebody said to me tonight when they came in, but nothing that you said has made any difference whatsoever, and that is the truth. And so, you just have to keep talking about these issues all the time, but it's quite phenomenal that there has been so little improvement. In fact, I see the aid industry getting worse and worse. So we definitely need a big change. So sorry to end on a pessimistic note.
Thank you. These are concluding points. I agree with that approach. I think my key points are that, which I've said already, but I want to emphasize. Honesty, independence, and that means independence of thought as much as organizational independence that we have in this world. Trust not in ourselves as professionals, but trust in the people who are impacted most by crisis and disaster. Because I've learned time and time again that they have a stake in their own survival and are far smarter at being able to figure out the right strategy. Fourthly, wisdom to know when you can't make a difference, and this is a point you debated just now, and I agree with that. And above all else, be aware that while many things remain perpetual, and as you said in your poignant remark, you wrote about it, and you talked about it, and nothing changed, or this, that, and the other, and maybe it's got worse. Well, it may be because we are having the wrong conversation. And I guess what I'm trying to say, perhaps not so very well, is to say we need a shift and have a different dialogue. And this is what I meant earlier when I say we're starting off from the wrong place. And if you ask the questions or the same assumptions that you're making, which are failures, don't be surprised that you get the same answers, which will keep on failing for the future. And I think that's the dumbest thing to do, which is to keep on repeating the same old stuff, which hasn't got you very far up to now. Having said that, actually we've also seen a lot of progress in many areas. For example, greater awareness, the fact we're here debating these issues, the fact that new ideas coming on, the fact that humanitarianism is no longer the business of humanitarians. It is the business of ordinary people. Because, and this is why I emphasized in my talk, I want to go back to the roots of humanitarianism. Humanitarianism was not invented by humanitarians. It's an instinct that came from humanity. So, why don't we go back to that? Why don't we return to the fount of all ideas, in a way? And then maybe that will take us in directions which will give us the answers to some of these questions of what to do in Somalia and what not to do in particular Somalia. So in a sense, that's what I'm arguing for as the challenge of all thinking people, all good-hearted thinking people, that is. And let's do it.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, opinions. There's one thing that remains certain, that the humanitarian principles serve a specific purpose, and it is to make humanitarian work easier, safer, and more important to the beneficiaries and not to the humanitarian workers. And at the bottom line is, whatever misadventures some of our organizations choose to have with these principles, it has a consequence for the rest of us. And that remains to be a point that can't be debated that much. And with those few words, I want to welcome my other boss, Dr. James Kisia, to give the final remark. And that's 30 seconds.
Those of you who don't know about ICHA, it's only 1 year old. And I think our speakers today were staking their reputation on a little known unit at Kenya Red Cross. And we want to give our appreciation for that. I called Fiona to ask her whether she would be a discussant with Mukesh. And to my surprise, she very quickly agreed that she will come on board. And we agreed that we'll, develop the subject a little bit better and then get back to her. I had known Fiona's work before I know her. Actually, previous to this, I only met her twice. And I want to thank her for coming in and giving a very practical approach to the principles and a provocative and practical examples from our work from MSF and ICRC. We want to thank Abbas Goulet, our Secretary General, and the parent organization, the Kenya Red Cross, because they have supported us as we try to grow the center. And I think without the support of the main organization, it becomes very difficult to move that forward. There are many movement partners here that have supported not only the Kenya Red Cross, but the idea of ICHA. And we also want to thank them for coming up. Our friends from the Australian Embassy and those from DFID and other organizations, we want to thank them for coming in and contributing to this discussion. And last but not least, I want to thank my colleagues at ICHA, including Idris, who have been working at this and been working hard to make sure that we have a good debate, guiding and making sure that the venue and all that, Idris, Joyce, Sarah, Januba, and Agnes. Thank you very much.